Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Thought Leaders. I'm your host, Chris Shang. Today we are visited by Melissa Madian, who is a author and revenue expert. She has a tremendous amount of experience in the world of sales and revenue, and I'm happy to have her on today. Thank you so much for joining us, Melissa. Of
Thank you for allowing me to be on the show.
course. Tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of what you've got working on right now, and then, if you're working with specific clients and or customers, what does that look like?
Yeah, you bet. Hi everyone. I am Melissa Madian, joining you from my office in gorgeous Toronto, Canada. I am actually a mechanical engineer by background. But through a combination of opportunity and amazing personality, I ended up in sales. I have done sales, I've carried a bag, I've led sales teams, I've led sales engineering teams, I've been in marketing, I've run marketing campaigns. I fell into the field of sales enablement quite a few years back before it was a thing, before everybody was talking about it. I like to think it more of revenue enablement because the deal or the experience and enablement doesn't just stop when the deal closes. You actually have to enable the folks that are talking to the customer post sale. So that to me encompasses revenue enablement. So I've been doing a revenue enablement for the better part of the last, I'm going to say 10ish or so years. I don't know. Time like has lost all meaning for me, especially since the pandemic. And as I get older, I'm just not paying attention to how much time is going by. But basically, what I do now, I went out on my own about 5ish or so years ago, and I work with organizations. They use me if they're trying to determine how to make their sales experience better, how to make their revenue more efficient, their revenue generating folks more efficient. How can you streamline sales processes and post sales processes? How to improve the experience that buyers and customers are having with the organization. There's some of the things, or hey, I've heard of this enablement thing, but I don't know what to do about it. That's some of the ways that folks engage with me to just make their sellers better, but also make the experience that buyers have with their revenue generating organizations a better thing.
Got it. Yeah, I'm super excited to dive into some of the granularities here because I think we've had a lot of people come in and talk about more of like the marketing side, top of funnel side of things, and mid funnel. But we're really kind of going to focus on today more of, let's imagine you have a healthy pipeline, and how do you get now your product to then making the purchase, going through the sales cycle, and then obviously implementation and onboarding is a big thing too, where I think
Yeah.
a lot of people don't ever typically think about that, especially in the earlier part of the process. But it's super critical, especially as it refers back to retention, and then some of these metrics around churn and things like that. So, yeah. Um, in terms of like the types of companies that you work with, is there any particular like verticals, size, stages, or is it kind of everything under the sun?
No, it's one of the great things about being in revenue enablement. It's the size. Usually, size is, do you have a sales team? That's typically, or someone who's responsible for bringing in business. Um, are they, larger than 5 people? That's sort of why folks bring me in. But I've worked with like smaller startup-y type companies who are just, they want to get it right from the beginning.
Yeah.
So they bring me in to try and help structure their processes and stuff like that. And then I work with folks that already have something in place, but it's grown so rapidly that now processes are unwieldy and everything. And that's typically why I'm brought in. What's interesting too is what I find is most organizations, and I work with a lot of software as a service. So if you're going to talk vertical, most of my business is done in software as a service. That's where I've kind of grown up and been. And most of those folks have grown organically and rapidly.
Mhm.
So there's not a lot of process in place. And process is usually like a dirty word. It's like, oh, I don't want to put in a sales process. I should just my seller sell and all that kind of stuff. And actually how I view it is, and maybe it's just the engineer in me, process is about making things more efficient for the people who are out there in front of the customer. And time is finite. So the more efficient you can make the process, the more time you're now giving back to your revenue generating functions. And that's kind of how I look at putting in process and enablement.
Yeah. Which I think, I mean, I echo the sentiment. I think it's so critical. When you kind of come in and work with an organization, is there like a checklist of things that you look for, that you're kind of like auditing or kind of keeping an eye out for, that you tend to see, organizations kind of like miss on?
Yeah. First thing I always do is an assessment. Like, what's your current state? What's going on right now? What's where are there places that feel like friction, either in the sales process or the engagement with the buyer? Because quite often it's got to be about the buyer. So if there's friction with the buyer, what's going on there? I take a look at what are your sellers doing right now, and how do they go to market. And usually what I see is everyone's kind of doing their own thing, and everyone thinks what they're doing is the best, so don't bother me, I'm doing well. um, and what I see is a lot of not an inconsistency across the board on how people are finding information, how people are getting content, how people are interacting with their target buyer. And again, it's that sort of lack of process, because a lot of folks aren't terribly process oriented. So and they shy away from it because they're like, nobody likes to talk about process. So what I usually see is, okay, you're doing a bunch of things, and there's sort of random acts of enablement and sales process and training and things happening. How do you actually pull all of that together and make it more efficient and make it easy? Like, really what you're just trying to do is make it easy for your people who are interacting with your buyers to have really great conversations with those buyers, and then ultimately drive them to revenue.
Yeah. Is there, is there typically like a metric or a KPI that you are looking at that becomes like a leading indicator that, not having process is becoming an issue? I'm imagining things like, length of like sales cycle and maybe even like size of deals and things like that, that can be very tangible in terms of like a byproduct from a messy sales process. But
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, for sure. Like velocity through the sales funnel. So, how quickly are your deals moving from when they're declared an opportunity to when they close? That's usually a great indicator of how healthy is is your actual opportunity pipeline. Like you mentioned at the beginning, like there's a lot of top of funnel stuff too.
right.
Like, how much volume do you have going into your funnel, and are there enough opportunities in there and stuff like that. But speed in which the deals are going through or opportunities are going through can really tell you what's going on. And if things get stuck in certain stages, that usually is an indicator too. Like, something's not right about the process here, because deals are all kind of glutting into one area and just getting stuck there, and nothing's coming out the other end, or like there's a trickle happening in the other end. It's like, well, what's going on in this area that you have here? And usually it has something to do with the words that are coming out of the seller's mouth, or how the seller has assessed the actual opportunity and the validity of the opportunity. And those are both things that can be fixed by effective enablement and effective training.
Yeah. Um, I'd like to kind of get into more like the tangible takeaways of when you come in. Let's just say, for example, you're saying like there's these blockers around what's coming out of the seller's mouth, and then uh, to me, it's always like it drills down to, you know, uh, miscommunication or misalignment of expectations from both sides, and that obviously breaks down to communication, and one side or the other is not clearly identifying or speaking on something, or the other person is not really interpreting it. So.
Yeah.
How do you go in and then start to, I mean, trying to visualize this like in a day-to-day operation, but like you go in and then assess the situation and then start making recommendations, right?
Yes.
And what are those recommendations based off of? Is it from experience, from kind of having seen these repeated flavors before, and then, like this is what I'm thinking is going to work here because I've seen a similar situation 2 to 3 times over there. How are you kind of like coming at this, or is it on an ad hoc basis? Is it starting from scratch, talking to customers and the whole nine?
Yeah. So the answer is yes. it's
All the
it's
above.
It's all of those things, right? I mean, I've been doing this for longer than I care to admit, so a lot of it is based on experience. So I've seen the movie play out. I know where it's going to go, and I know how it's going to end. Some of it is just pure objective assessment of what's going on and then making logical recommendations based on that, just based on sort of what logic dictates. Some of it is, oh, I see this is happening. I consume a lot of research. So I've read all of this research from a variety of different research firms like your Forresters and your Corporate Visions and your Gartners and that kind of thing. Based on that research, here are the logical things, the logical suggestions that I'm going to make from that. Interviews with the frontline sellers, the managers, the customers. What's the customer experience been like? Some organizations have actually done those kind of interviews, like they've
Yeah.
done win loss analysis and stuff like that. And I can actually sort of consume that content and see what's going on. So it's like you need, in order to get to a set of recommendations, there needs to be a thorough analysis of everything that's going on in the current state and also then comparing it to really good research
Yep.
to sort of make those correlations.
Got it. Are there certain like, I guess not commonalities, but uh, bottlenecks or issues that you tend to see more commonly across the board? And I would say, like, just from my experience, again, primarily working with startups, so this may be like outside of the area of your focus in terms of working with larger companies, but the things I see is like that they don't know who the stakeholders are, or they haven't mapped it out well enough to understand and take the workload off of the buyer to
Hmm.
move a deal along, right?
Yeah.
Do you see that a lot, or is that a common issue, or is there other ones that's more prevailing?
Yeah, that definitely. And something you said there about taking the work off the buyer, I think
Yeah.
that that is a huge thing, right? Like that's not just navigating the org chart or the decision making matrix inside of the organization, but just if you're forcing the buyer to navigate this journey on their own,
Oh, yeah.
you're you're putting a lot of work on them. And that buyer, I think what a lot of folks don't realize, whether they're selling or on the post-sale side, like whether they're managing a current customer, they don't realize that like they're the buyer's world,
Yeah.
whatever you're there's like you're like a tiny little
It's a
section of
blip.
their brain.
Exactly.
Yeah. Their brain is filled with like a bajillion other things that are going on in their work world, in their life. Like there's a bunch of things happening in their brain. So what I tell folks, what the mistake I see most folks make is they're not thinking about what's actually happening in the world of the buyer. And
Mm,
what I tell folks to do is you got to make it about them. Like you have to really consider what is going on in their world right now, what's going on in their brain, what's important to them, and make yourself valuable to them in context of their world. Because without that context, it's like, yeah, you could have a really great product, but without context of how does it fit in the world of the buyer, buyer's gonna be like, well, that seems nice and shiny, but
mm,
I got these 17 other things I got to deal with. Like, where do you fit in the 17 other things?
yeah. Yeah. Talk about making it easy for the buyer. Do you ever run into these issues because you've been in the SaaS space specifically? Another issue I see like is implementation and onboarding time, right? Sometimes where you're moving off of these legacy businesses and I think about companies I work with are selling into like freight forwarding or like, stuff that is steep tech learning curves. They buy software once every 10 years kind of deal. And their biggest concern is like, what's it going to take for me? Like you could be 50% cheaper, uh, have feature parity, but at the end of the day, like they're scared of moving off of an old platform for loss of data.
Oh yeah.
And I've seen a lot of companies not have a great process around how to make that implementation or migration smooth. What do you see in those instances? How do you make recommendations around that? Um, and which is your kind of like overall thinking from your the companies that you work with and how to approach
Yeah.
it?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because there's so many things that are happening kind of logically and then emotionally when
Uh,
you go from I've made the purchase, now I got to actually do something about it. And the emotion is like buyer's regret immediately kicks in, right? It's like, oh my God, I now
yeah,
have to go from this to that.
yeah,
Like, oh, help me. And so one of the things that you need to do to be a sort of buyer centric customer experience, positive experience organization is just guide them through that process. So just like sellers need to guide the buyer on the journey of buying from them, the folks who are responsible for implementation have to guide them on this journey. And the more bite-sized kind of
Mm.
baby steps you can take, the better. Like I used to work at a company called Eloqua, marketing automation software company, great Toronto Canadian success story, since been purchased by Oracle. And what we found is like marketing automation when it started was very difficult for folks to wrap their brains around because it was very new and it was all about emailing people and everything like that. And it's like, well, this is more than just emailing people.
Mhm.
And like when you have a really impressive platform that can do a lot of things, from the buyer's perspective, it's very daunting. It's like, oh my God, like I have to do all of these things to try and implement this. Like this will never happen. It's like the whole like boiling the ocean kind of a scenario, to use a hackneyed analogy. And what we started to do is at Elk was okay, let's just baby step this. Like let's just get them to step one and
Mhm.
then get them to the next thing. And so you do that and then you celebrate these like really small wins, but at least there's this feeling of forward momentum. Um, it's kind of like I was just rewatching, this is going to be so off topic, but I was
Yep.
rewatching the episode of Friends where Chandler and Monica are getting married and
Yep.
Chandler's like flipping out and Ross is like, "Okay, let's just do this a little like let's just get you back to the hotel and then like let's get you showered and then let's get your tux on." And just like when you take it in these baby steps, it just seems so less. So really the buyer is now Chandler and y'all got to be Ross and help them take those little baby steps to get to the end goal. And I think that's where the buyer starts to feel more like,
Mm.
okay, I can do this. I don't have to take my, hundreds of thousands of terabytes of data immediately port it over into this thing. It's like, let's just take it one step at a time and eventually you get there.
Yeah. I feel like a lot of that too is, um, when you're talking about some of these things that you're kind of coming in, right? It's like almost, um, it's a personality trait almost. It's almost like, coaching on empathy or coaching on compassion and coaching on some of these things where, you're really trying to get maybe a personality type that traditionally is in the sales game that's like maybe a little more self-serving to think a little bit more selflessly around the process. And so I'm curious, is like with that psychological component involved, like how do you then go around, coaching or advising groups that it may not come to them, very, I guess, like innately in terms of this kind of like way of thinking to
Hmm.
then bought into it. Because I think that's probably a half the battle, probably half, most of the times it's like getting people bought into it and then you can work the magic, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it has to come from the leaders. I'll say nothing happens without the leaders of the organization, truly believing in this idea of being centered on the buyer, being centered on the customer, being customer centric. Like a lot of organizations sort of pay the we're customer centric lip service, right? Well, no one's going to say that they're not customer centric, right? It becomes this sort of meaningless buzzword like we're customer centric. It's like, no, we're not customer centric. We think our customers suck and we all we care about is ourselves. Like nobody ever says that in the market. So, but do you believe it? Do you actually put your money where that mouth is and actually show that you're truly being customer centric? And it's got to come from the leaders. Like if the leaders aren't coaching to, are you in service of the buyer? If the leaders aren't managing pipelines to, well, are you spending all of this time on this target buyer just because it's a good looking account, or are you actually assessing whether or not this is going to be of value to this client, to the business? And those are tough conversations to have, but the leaders have to have them with their people, otherwise nothing changes and nothing happens. And if leadership's not behind it, it's going to be a lot harder for the people on the front line to bubble that up than it is for the leaders to send that down.
Got it. Got it. Makes sense. I'd love to dive into a little bit more about, maybe the different cycles or evolutions that you've seen transpire in this space, over the past 10, 15 years of you doing this, but and also since you've been on your own, right? So your scope of things that you've probably seen are a little bit like a wide array of different challenges that's probably prioritized itself and funneled itself to the top over these past few years. Um, what's been some of these bigger changes that you've seen maybe like the past year or 2 years? And then, maybe even like alluding back to the pandemic and maybe how that shifted things perhaps, which I know it did in a lot of areas, to now.
Yeah, I mean, I've been around long enough to remember like client server software and like software you had to actually install on very large machines,
Yep.
to cloud-based, to software as a service, to AI coming into play, right? So certainly the one of the big shifts was that kind of on-premise to cloud, cloud to software as a service kind of mini hop. And then certainly in the last 3-ish years or so, even 2 years or so, like the acceleration towards AI and leveraging AI type platforms and tools to assist in the selling experience. And the AI one's actually really interesting, right? Because well, everyone's talking about it, so it becomes noise, but very few are actually thinking about, okay, how can I actually take AI and apply it in my day-to-day life? And there's like a lot of very sensationalistic articles about, there's no need for salespeople. AI will take care of everything. And I think that's a little nuts.
Yeah.
You do still need people to position and sell your product, but where AI can kind of come into play is, can you just make it more efficient for me to do this job? And I think there, like platforms like Tiga and stuff, like there's some stuff out there that you can actually use to just make yourself more efficient. And I think that's kind of the next iteration that I'm starting to see up there. How can I use AI to make my life more efficient, not necessarily replace my job, because I don't think it's a replace. I think it's a just make me more efficient kind of a thing. The pandemic's been interesting because I've seen, just to switch to the pandemic, switching from this need to be in person to being able to execute virtually. And I think in North America, before the pandemic, virtual was certainly there. Like a lot of certainly inside sellers were mostly doing things virtually anyway. It's just the rest of the world had to kind of get on board with selling virtually. And now a lot of organizations, 100% of their time is done virtually. And that's been interesting to see sort of the evolution of how virtual has become more of the dominant way to communicate and sell versus being in person. Like I remember the old school days, your seller would have a territory and you got into your car and you drove in that territory and you drove around, you visited all your clients. You don't really have to do that anymore. You can do that a lot more efficiently if you do it virtually. It just has to be valuable.
Mm,
Then, if you're going to do it virtually, you can't just book a meeting with a customer or book a Zoom or anything with a customer and expect them to show up. It's like you have to actually make it valuable and efficient. You have to make it valuable and worth their time to do it, because everybody else is booking their time with Zoom right now.
yeah, that's true. Um, I have a couple of questions that one is around AI, as you mentioned. I feel like yes, it can definitely be it's a great research tool for the sales process. It's a great way to think and make things more efficient, but it does have to lend itself back to, I think, people who are process oriented to
Mm,
understand where the gaps are that they can optimize against for.
yeah,
I think that's where we see a lot of these grandiose things come from, is from like people who may not truly like it's and I'm not knocking anything, but I see like the old school sales mentality of like, oh, we can use this to displace everything, and now we can do these personalized messages at scale and blah blah blah. But I think that um I think it's creating a lot of noise already in front of people that have minimal attention.
yeah,
And you're just, creating a lot more things that's gonna ultimately what it does, I think, is just shuts people's attention off from a particular channel.
yeah,
So if you're just using AI and people are, now producing 10 times the amount of things that are hitting your inbox from the recipient standpoint, there's just 10 times more stuff for them to try to sort through. And it doesn't matter if you're selling the cure for cancer or talking about the person's mom by the first name. Like at the
yeah.
end of the day, they're probably not going to be in there looking at things and being much more dismissive around it just by sheer volume of what's coming in.
Oh
Be
yeah,
curious
for
your, yeah, curious as to your standpoint on some of those things.
Yeah, well, what's interesting, I totally agree with you. The interesting thing is folks have forgotten that like any tool is useless if there's no value behind it for the
Hmm.
person receiving the message, right? Like I'm going to open that email or respond to that LinkedIn connection request or pick up that or make that phone call or book that meeting if you are telling me something that's of value to me. So yeah, addressing me by first name or mentioning my cat Pickle because you saw me post my cat photos on, that's great, but why are you contacting me? Like, you need to provide me with some value that's going to be relevant to me. So it's context again. Like, whatever your positioning needs to be in context for why I should care. Like, what's in it for me? Why should I care? So what kind of a thing? And I think if you're going to use AI, that's great. But if you're not infusing that value into how you're using AI and you're not incorporating it into a process, as you mentioned, it's not gonna, yeah, it might help you send a whole whack of emails, but those emails are gonna be completely
Yeah.
useless. Like I still get LinkedIn requests for people trying to sell me stuff. And I'm like, one really quick look at my profile will tell you that I am not the person that is buying for sales a sales team. Like I get messages talk about we can improve your sales teams. I'm like, I am an individual consultant, and it says that on my profile. Like, simple research. So
Hmm.
could you have used AI to do that research? Absolutely. And then you could have created something that would be of value to me and why I should pick up
Yeah.
that call, that message, make that LinkedIn connection. So it needs to be a marriage
Yeah.
of, a little bit of thought and insight, and then you can use AI just to make yourself more efficient to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, as we're running up on time here, I'm curious as to your thoughts as to some of the things that, when you're working with clients today, what are some of the things that they're concerned about? What are some of the things that you're helping them plan, strategize for the next 6 months to the year, and then perhaps beyond that?
Yeah. So definitely, certainly in software as a service too, right now in everyone's mind is just everything is slowed down. Like people are
Mm,
locking down budgets, people are not spending money. So that's definitely top of mind. How do we fill our funnel with a lot of good quality opportunities? And how do we close the opportunities that we have at the highest dollar value that we can get them in at? I mean, that's kind of always been the top concern of revenue leaders, but it just seems to be more top of mind for folks. And I think because there's just so much noise in the market space, there's so many
yeah.
people trying to gain access to the same group of buyers. So it's just the angst around it has become so much greater because there are so many people knocking on the doors, and it is so much easier to knock on everybody's door. And so it's like, how do I cut through that noise? Like that's the other top thing, is how do I cut through all of that noise with that nugget of insight that is going to be valuable to the
Hmm.
target buyer that I have. So one of the things that I work with folks on is first, like, do you have the most efficient process so that it is easy for your sellers to do these repetitive tasks over and over again in a valuable way? But also, like, what is that unique insight? What is that little piece of gold that you want to put in your buyers' brains to get them to go, "Oh yeah, this is I'm going to pick up the phone and answer your call, or I'm going to answer your email because you're actually giving me something that's of value," and really forcing them to think about that.
Yeah. Last question here is just kind of, you mentioned the idea of value. What are some tangible, like, pieces of value that a company can focus on providing to the buyers? Because I think a lot of the times that value is not directly related to your product or service. I know a lot of times through these conversations, a recurring theme comes up, which is like there's a more higher need nowadays for sales reps to be problem solvers.
Mm,
And so, coming to the table with solutions that may or may not be directly related to your what you're selling. Um, and that can be the value that you're providing. You have to bring knowledge to the buyer of something that they are not aware of. Um, but I'm curious as to, like, is that something that you think about? Is it another piece of value? Is it more of a tangible thing? Uh,
mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, I'd say definitely reps need to be problem solvers. Anywhere along the buying chain, you need to be a problem solver, especially if it's post sale.
Mm,
But I mean, it's true of like account managers who are trying to expand into accounts. They need to be problem solvers as well. The thing I would say is the product is not, and what the product brings is not what's going to move the buyer in any
yep,
shape. It's going to be the context. It's going to be what problem are you having, buyer or customer, and how does my solution solve for your problem? And that context is what's going to get the buyer emotionally engaged in whatever it is that's being positioned. Because without that, it's like you can know the product inside and out, but if you don't understand what the value is, like I remember I work with one sales rep. I kid you not, he did not know, he never went into the product. He had no idea what the product like actually did. Like if you asked him to log into the product and do things, he would have no idea how to do it. Like he never actually touched the product at all. But what he knew was the top challenges that his target territory had and how the product solved those challenges. So in context for them. And so what he would talk about is, hey, I know folks like you, they have these challenges. I know that they're struggling to do these things. Is that what you're experiencing? Oh yeah, okay. Well, what if you could do it this way instead? What if you could solve for this, and that put it into, and they're like, "Oh, I get it. Now I understand what you're trying to, and I have this great product. Here you go. Here's how you would use it." And that context is what's going to move the needle for folks. It's like, now I get why your product fits into my world.
yeah, that's a tricky thing to train people on, I feel
Oh
like.
yeah, if it were easy, everybody would be doing it and everyone would do it amazingly.
Yeah, yeah, that context part. Um, yeah, anyways,
But I
uh,
will say what I usually tell folks is look at your current customer base
yeah,
and
that's a good
see
point.
how they are using, how they are successfully using your product, and if there's any sort of interesting ways that they're using your product. And that will probably tell you that value, that gold ticket value, that's probably where you'll find it in your current customer base.
Absolutely. On that note, I think that's a great last piece of advice for people to take away from. Always talk to your customers, always look at what they're doing, where they realize value from, because that can be regurgitated back to the new buyers, new prospects. So
Exactly.
awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking the time today, Melissa. I think it was very insightful. Great to hear your journey and just your sharing of your expertise.
Oh, thank you, Chris. It was a pleasure.
Awesome. Thank you.